I was going to do a video on the Greek afterlives plural, but as usually happens when I start researching something, the topic turned out to be a lot more complex than I initially thought. So, today I'm doing a video on just the Homeric afterlife, and figuring out what he actually believed based on his works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Because apparently just that question alone is in contention among some scholars, and the debate is fascinating. Did Homer and his contemporaries really think that the dead lost all of who they were? Let's take a look. Kairete! When I put my wish list up, I never expected the generosity I've received, but I'm extremely grateful to those of you who have sent me things. On Thursday, I received Finding Persephone, Women's Rituals in the Mediterranean, from a donor that didn't leave a gift note, so thank you and a shout out to whoever sent it. Then, on Saturday, Frustrated Atheist decided to pick up Athenian Myths and Festivals for me by Christian Sourvinou-Inwood and Robert Parker. It means a lot to me, and will let me dig a bit deeper into several of the festivals that I haven't covered yet, as well as to help me make individual videos on some of the ones that I have in the future. Thank you so much for your support, it means the world to me. This video was actually inspired by another book I picked up myself with the support of my patrons, Reading Greek Death by Christian Sourvinou-Inwood. Her other book, Reading Greek Culture, is on order and still en route from Japan. With all the tomfoolery with the administration and the post office, I have no idea when it's going to be here, but both have been heavily referenced in other works I have on various topics. She gave some arguments at the beginning that blew my mind wide open about conventional scholarship and what Homer might have actually believed based on textual evidence. But in order to get there, we're gonna need to figure out what most of us have been taught and why. In several live streams, I've mentioned the idea that to Homer and his ilk, the dead were witless, or devoid of knowledge of who they were. Several prominent Greek scholars put forward this idea, though the three loudest are Robert Garland in his book The Greek Way of Death, M.P. Nilsson in his work on the Minoan Religion and its survival in Greek cultus, and Walter Burkert in Greek Religion. Their arguments were largely based on certain passages in Odyssey 10 and 11, where the dead are called mindless or witless, and where Kirke points out that Tiresias has his wits about him and is unique among shades for this reason. We'll take a look at where these ideas come from later, but for now, let's examine the passages referenced here. In Odyssey 10, 487 through 495, Odysseus narrates thus after having asked Kirke to tell him how to get home. So I spoke, and the beautiful goddess straightway made an answer. Son of Laertes, sprung from Zeus, Odysseus of many devices, abide ye now no longer in my house against your will, but you must first complete another journey, and come to the house of Hydes and dread Persephone, and to seek the soothsaying of the spirit of Theban Tiresias, the blind seer, whose mind abides steadfast. To him, even in death, Persephone has granted reason that he alone should have understanding, but the others flit about as shadows. Well, that seems pretty convincing, right? Here we have the character in his own authority in the narrative telling us the words of a goddess, and she tells him that the dead are senseless and without self, and that Tiresias is the exception. We get a similar echo in two passages in Odyssey 11, at 151, where Odysseus' mother doesn't recognize him until she drinks the blood of his offering, and again at 476, when Achilles calls the dead Aphrodis, or lacking intelligence. But let's take a closer look at this section of the story. Although it's true that Odysseus makes a blood offering here to summon Tiresias, he uses a sword to keep the shades that come up out of Hydes away from the blood until Tiresias comes up to talk to him. So why is it that before Tiresias arrives at 1190, we get a scene with Odysseus' fallen comrade Elpenor, who is fully articulate and quite frustrated at being unable to enter Hydes on account of being unburied? Odysseus would not allow anyone to get anywhere near the blood that he was offering to Tiresias under instructions of the goddess, and nowhere does it mention an exception for Elpenor. Also, if we go back to Odyssey 10 from earlier and continue Kirke's speech, she gives a curious instruction to Odysseus regarding supposedly non-sentient shades. Thither, prince, do thou draw nigh, as I bid thee, and dig a pit of a cubit's length this way and that, and around it pour a libation to all the dead, first with milk and honey, thereafter with sweet wine, and in the third place with water, and sprinkle thereon with barley meal. And do thou earnestly entreat the powerless heads of the dead, vowing that when thou comest to Ithaca thou wilt sacrifice in thy halls a barren heifer, the best thou hast, and wilt fill the altar with rich gifts, and that to Tiresias alone thou wilt sacrifice separately a ram wholly black, the goodliest of thy flock. But when with prayers thou hast made supplication to the glorious tribes of the dead, then sacrifice a ram in black ewe, turning their heads toward Erebus, but thyself turning backwards, and setting thy face towards the streams of the river. Then many ghosts of men that are dead will come forth, But do thou thereafter call to any of thy comrades, and bid them flay and burn the sheep that lie there, slain by the pitiless bronze, and make prayer to the gods, to mighty Hyades and to dread Persephone. And do thou thyself draw thy sharp sword from beside thy thigh, and sit there, not suffering the powerless heads of the dead to draw near the blood, till thou hast required of Teresos. Then the seer shall presently come to thee, leader of men, and he will tell thee thy way and the measures of thy path, and of thy return, how thou mayest go over the teeming deep. Odysseus does this at the beginning of chapter 11, by the way, but as Sourvinou-Inwood points out in Reading Greek Death, why would one swear an oath to witless shades who do not know who they are until after they drink blood that is physically in front of them, when they're unable to process what has just been spoken? Something strange is afoot. Sourvinou-Inwood also points out that later in chapter 11, when Aias comes out of Hyades in 538 through 565, he doesn't drink the blood, but does refuse to speak to Odysseus out of the wrath he still felt for him from his death. Odysseus even placates him. Aias, son of peerless Telamon, wast thou not then even in death to forget thy wrath against me, because of those accursed arms? Surely the gods set them to be a bane to the Argives. Such a tower of strength was lost to them in thee, and for thee in death we Achaeans sorrow unceasingly, even as for the life of Achilles, son of Peleus. Yet no other is to blame but Zeus, who bore the terrible hatred against the host of Danan's spearmen, and brought on thee thy doom. Nay, come hither, prince, that thou mayest hear my word and speech, and subdue thy wrath and thy proud spirit. But it is to no avail. So I spoke, but he answered me not a word, but went on his way to Erebus to join the other spirits of the dead and gone. Then would he nevertheless have spoken to me for all his wrath, or I to him, but the heart in my breast was fain to see the spirits of those others that are dead. If Aias were so witless without blood, then why would he refuse to answer Odysseus? And why would Odysseus, if he believed Aias to be witless and mindless, attribute this refusal to the answer in first person to his wrath from life? As Sourvinou-Inwood points out, this would have stood out to Homer and his audience as wrong if they believed completely that the shades in Hyades were witless and mindless, and that by drinking blood they became aware again. Also, the fact that Tiresias retains his mind, yet still drinks the blood offering is another strange flag. The likelihood that Homer simply omitted the blood drinking is low, given that epic, by its oral nature, has a great deal of repetition to help the poets who will retell a story remember it. If the blood drinking happened, it would have been noted verbally. So, what can we make of these strange, seemingly contradictory beliefs? We'll get back to that, but in order to answer the question in the video title, we need to look at another aspect of belief that scholars have widely held to be true that might be in question. Nilsson proposed in his The Minoan-Mycenaean Religion and its Survival in Greek Religion that it was likely that the Minoans believed in a paradise far beyond the sea. He also theorized that the dead rulers were deified in ancient Minoan rites due to a specific image found in a specific burial site, where what appeared to be a dead king had been glorified in ritual by three other figures. This becomes important later in Odyssey 11, when we're told that Minos and Menelaus, who could have been Minoan kings, rule over the fields of Eleusis, where some people, namely the heroes that were born of the gods, are given immortality. Sourvinou-Inwood, however, takes issue with this view. She points out that the clothing in the figure being honored in the images that Nilsson references is not the same as those of the gods, and points out that the person could have been a priest performing rites for the gods, and this image could have captured an idea of their life. She also points out that the presence of small carved wooden boats and grave goods, assumed by Nilsson to be there for transport to the afterlife beyond the sea, could have served other functions in the afterlife, particularly if the person was a seaman or a fisherman. We have so little written from the Minoans and the Mycenaeans that we know so little about their religious beliefs, as we haven't deciphered Linear A. She points out that Nilsson is making a critical mistake by extrapolating later beliefs onto the past on the grounds that the physical locations are the same and the cultures are related, so remnants must exist. However, as we'll see, this might not be the best assumption for changing cultures and belief structures. The above arguments about the gravesite and others like it led Nilsson to declare Homer's Fields of Elysion to be a remnant of Minoan beliefs regarding paradise for a select few, rather than a contemporary belief for Homer and his audience. This is where we come to Inwood's counterpoint. According to scholars like Nilsson, Garland, Sourvinou-Inwood, and others, Homer was likely working with older epics when he composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Sourvinou-Inwood proposes that due to a number of inconsistencies, several of which I pointed out, and a few of which reside in the Iliad regarding Achilles and Patroclus, the majority of the evidence in the two poems points to the idea of dead who not only know who they are, but can receive offerings on those grounds. After After all, why would Odysseus be instructed to make an oath to dead who cannot understand it? And why would Achilles talk about ruling over witless shades later in Odyssey 11 when he's called up and says hello? He expresses in this passage that it is better to be a slave in the world of reliving than to rule over the dead, and some scholars have taken it to mean the dead were witless and mindless, but as Inwood pointed out, how could somebody rule over mindless shades? Homer's audience would have seen that as a contradiction, along with Elpenor at the beginning of the book and Patroclus in the Iliad. What's more likely, according to Inwood, is that these scenes were emerging of older versions of the story which the Mycenaeans, who didn't have a cult of the dead as far as scholars can tell, believed the dead were only able to understand who they were when they drank a blood of an offering. Homer and his contemporaries likely believed the dead did understand who they were, and why offerings were being given to them. Otherwise, the majority of interactions with the dead would always contain a blood offering, and as we've seen, they don't. Another major point that Inwood makes is that the Greeks of the 8th century did have a cult of the dead as far as scholars can tell, as multiple offerings have been found at tombs and burial sites over the centuries. Why would a family make offerings to mindless shades? It seems silly, given that the purpose of an offering is charis, which, if you haven't yet seen my video on offerings, the link is in the iCard above. Which brings us back to the fields of Eleusis and the Eleusinian Mysteries. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the mysteries were a rite performed in Eleusis, involving initiates from all over Greece once a year, and were a closely guarded secret for which we have little written attestation. It was said that a great thing was witnessed at the end which gave one access to the better afterlife, and this belief is hinted at in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where it is declared that Demeter showed the mysteries to men, which, once beheld, would give them access to a better afterlife. Note that this has nothing to do with one's behavior in life, only with whether or not one had achieved this particular initiation. I'm gonna do a video separately on the mysteries at some point in the future. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. The last thing I'd like to touch on is the topography of Hyades. There's a brief description given in Odyssey 11 of the entrance to Hyades and a river, as of yet unnamed, that shades cannot cross without permission from Hyades and Persephone, but Odysseus, under Circe's divine protection, does. The souls of the dead are said to fly there of their own accord in every passage outside of Odyssey 24, though a number of scholars believe that Odyssey 24 is interpolated for a number of stylistic and belief-related reasons. If you all are interested, I can do a more detailed series of videos on the Odyssey and the various scholarly opinions about it. The lack of detail on the matter is likely due to the widespread belief that the realm itself is unseen to those who don't belong there, so when multiple descriptions of Hyades conflict, it wasn't really seen as strange. The ancients even understood that the poetic license was given by the writers. Alright, so we're back to the question at the beginning of the video. What would the Homeric afterlife be like? The idea of individual fates does have hint in Homer, though the average person would likely end up in the same place. Achilles being said to rule over the dead and Minos being the ruler of Eleusia are two such hints, as are the entreatments to the Erinyes who, quote, punish oath-breakers in the afterlife by Odysseus toward the end of the Odyssey 11. Most people ended up in the same spot, unless you did something really bad by breaking an oath sworn with the gods as witness, or were amazing in life and related to the gods somehow. But you probably wouldn't be mindless, and Hyades and Persephone could let you out to be with your family briefly when offerings were made if they were asked nicely. Homer describes Hyades as underground, dark, and a bit windy, but also talks about Persephone ruling over the blessed dead and a better spot existing for some awesome people, so it's not exactly terrible. Life is just better than death, so don't go rushing to death anytime soon. There's your lesson. Thank you all for sticking with me through that. I fell down a heck of a research rabbit hole on it when I first read Inwood's refutation of scholarship I'd read in the past, and it really got me thinking. I'm planning on covering the afterlife as seen in Frogs by Aristophanes and Plato's afterlife in the future in their own videos, but I hope that you enjoyed what you heard today. If so, dig a trench and offer the subscribe button at the mouth of a cave entrance to Hyades. Break the notification bell that your blessed ancestors may use it in the next life, and be sure to toss a like because they probably know who you are and that you watched the video. Drop down into the comments and let me know if you learned anything, or just tell me off for talking about an afterlife if that's all your speed. Special thanks to GaelicNox for their artwork, as always link in the description to their Twitter and website, and special thanks to my patrons. Without all of you, I wouldn't be able to afford the expensive book that sent me down this rabbit hole in the first place. I pride myself on making these arguments more accessible and breaking down the paywalls, blocking folks from finding out this sort of info, and I'm so grateful for your help every month. I wouldn't be able to do it without you. And remember, we're stronger together.